Ladies and gentlemen, if you like PEDs, well, then you're going to love an episode that starts with, well, if you like PEDs. But if you like PEDs, you're in for a treat. Because on this episode of the DDT Method Podcast, I was lucky enough to sit down and get to talk to Mr. Broderick Chavez. If you're in the bodybuilding world, and if you're in the performance world, if you're in the strength and conditioning world, and you're into it at a level that includes PEDs, you know exactly who this guy is. Broderick Chavez is a highly respected expert in the world of performance enhancement. And on this week's episode, we're going to break down a ton of information on just that. Now, I do want to apologize. We had some technical difficulties, much like my ability to speak, in this recording, but it was luckily only the video and it was only on the Wi-Fi on Broderick's end. That's not me bagging on Broderick's Wi-Fi. That's me bagging on unreliable Wi-Fi in general. Sometimes it's bad on my end, but we did have an issue with the video on Broderick's end. So I was on the fence about putting in a couple of humorous pictures and AI depictions of Broderick, but AI was unable to spit out anything that looked anything like Broderick. So we're just going to put up some pictures and we're just going to carry through with the audio. So those of you that would love the opportunity to just stare at me and Broderick talking to each other, well, that's kind of weird, but I'm sorry that we can't supply that, but the audio is 100%. And ladies and gentlemen, with that apology in mind, this is the DDT Method Podcast with Broderick Chavez. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the DDT Method Podcast. And this is a very special episode, meaning that it's a very good episode, but I'm going to rant about it because today I get the opportunity to speak to somebody in the industry that I don't know personally, but I've looked up to for a while. He's no nonsense, he's no bullshit, and he happens to be one of the smartest people when it comes to PEDs, in my opinion, on the planet. I don't need to blow smoke, and I've used this line before, but if I was going to kiss anybody's ass, it would be to get them to appear on the podcast. Once they're already here, all bets are off. So you know what I'm saying is totally true. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here with Broderick Chavez. Broderick, for anybody that might not be familiar with you or your work, just give us a little bit of a rundown on yourself, what you've done, what you do. It can be as long or as short as you want to make it.
Wow, we really start with the thing I hate the most, which is talking about me. But in reverse order, I really don't coach much anymore. So I operate a pay site regarding performance enhancing drugs and the complementary training, nutrition, methodology, psychology, basically the periodization necessary to get the most out of. I almost used a word that I find very evil there, to optimize, which I think is a not only an overused word, but an inappropriately used word. Moving in reverse order from that, I had a pretty extensive career as a strength athlete. Um, Very, very high level powerlifting, moderately successful at strongman. Every other thing you can think of in the realms of strength, I have done, save Olympic lifting because I have little baby hands and I'm very, very slow. So Olympic lifting was just not a thing that I was literally physically capable of. Um, but strongman, Highland Games, all kinds of stuff. Um, teen Turning 20 was quite the delineation. Pre turning 20, obviously I was a teenager. I was a bodybuilder. I was almost, and a bit brash to say, but a bit of a prodigy teenage bodybuilder in an era when bodybuilding was actually quite competitive in the teen realm. 80 through 90, if you don't know, teenage bodybuilding was quite a thing. All of the people that you can think of, Jay Cutler, Chris Aceto, Sean Ray, all of those people were teen bodybuilders in that window. So it was quite the era. Um, I chose to make that switch kind of for the comedic reason that every bodybuilder kind of moves to powerlifting is. I was like, I'm a little burned out. Maybe I'll do this to put on some size and just catch up a little bit. And I came to realize that that was really where my um, I will say my interest lies, because I do have great interest in bodybuilding, but it was just a much better outlet for me, so that was why I stayed with it, didn't revert back to bodybuilding. And then continuing in sort of reverse order. Um, just a very silly series of really lucky coincidences. And there are those that'll make the argument that chance is something you create, not something you're given. Perhaps that's the case, but whether coincidence or force of will, I had the opportunity to surround myself with very, very high level people, um, people that I pale in comparison to. I had the privilege of spending time with Dr. Fred Hatfield and Tom Dieters and Tom Platz and just some really Dr. Maru Di Pasquale, Gary Jones of Hammer Strength, like those sorts of people, and just it was probably the one unifying thing that I could tie all this together is um, regardless of my prowess in any one sport, my real prowess in this world is just sort of a relentless, possibly to the point of mental illness, pursuit of the whys. I just really, really want to know the whys. And weirdly, now coming back to modern times, the commercialization of all the whys I've collected is very weird and awkward and difficult for me. I really didn't collect the whys to then be like the world's biggest expert and like sell things. I collected the whys because for some reason I just needed to fucking know. So an awkward way to tell that tale, but that's vaguely who I am.
Well, I think pursuing the why, or maybe even you can expand that into pursuing the how. It's almost like a lost art these days because I don't know if you want to blame it on social media or blame it on the current climate, culture, etc., whatever you want to tag on it to make it sound fancy. But people are just looking for cut, copy, paste protocols, and the why tends to boil down to, well, because it works. And I remember the first coach I ever stopped working with, I stopped working with them, and I won't name any names, but it was because they told me to do something, and I said, I'm not questioning you. I just want to learn, why are we doing this thing? And his response was, because it works. And that put such a bad taste in my mouth at 21, 22 years old, whatever I was, that I was like, no, this isn't happening. But the why is the most important thing, in my opinion, that's being overlooked. And I don't know if it's that people are lazy or people just want the quickest possible answer. But that brings me back to a point that I really wanted to spend some time on.
If I could interrupt there, and I apologize for doing so. It's your podcast, but um, the gray is not false. I am really this old. I'm actually coming up on my 54th birthday, and it's something my wife and I talk about regularly. The sort of how much has changed because of social media, and honestly, I think the only thing that has changed because of social media is the rate of what's going on, not the what that is going on. I think there's been a handful of people that wanted to know the whys since ever.
Mm-hmm.
But by and large, I think the average asshole just wants to know that their automobile works, not how, not why. I really don't think that's as new as people want to make it to be. Everybody wants to sort of create a tragedy where there isn't one. I think the vast number of people since time immemorial, just they're just people. They just do. They just want to get by, get along, have some success. I think there's a limited number of people with the defect that I have that just fucking need to know why.
Well, maybe it's a situation where the social media being present has just made the assholes more vocal or seemingly created the perception of them being more encompassing all around us.
Probably. That's what I mean. I think social media has just really made it louder and faster, but not really different.
Gotcha. Well, one thing that I will say is probably different about it is when you were learning, when you were cutting your teeth, when you were spending time around all these vastly intelligent people, it probably wasn't as easy as it is now to pull that out of your pocket and just start finding these people. So maybe that's the difference.
And yes, and then when I say, I use the word ruthless and relentless, Again, I don't want this to be self-aggrandizing, but because again, it's kind of mental illness, but understand what that means. You know, prior to 1990, there was no Google Maps. There were no fucking cell phones. There was hope and a compass. Like I knew that so and so was in White Plains, New York, and I knew that was vaguely north fucking west of where I was. So I drove. And prior to being old enough to drive, I rode a goddamn bus. Like bought a bus ticket to a place on a map and just was there. And then picked up a phone book and found a gym. And I'm like, walked in the gym and literally was like, do you know this guy? They're like, no, I never heard of him. Fuck, go to the next gym. Like, I'm not joking. As a teenager, I wandered the fucking earth looking for these people. At 14 years old, I got on a 747 out of Philadelphia and flew by my fuck self to LA. Got a taxi to Long Beach and just was there to find people to talk to because I knew that's where the weights and the drugs were.
So suddenly I feel like a much larger asshole now just for one day going, I'm going to start a podcast. So definitely I have to give beyond the amount of credit that's due for how you accumulated your knowledge, or at least how you began to. And then that obviously snowballed through there. So what I want to do, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say the beauty of that is, well, one, there's kind of no beauty to that. There's brute force and stupidity. But that brute force and stupidity creates a momentum that does then allow you to more and more doors. And if you have the chops to get through that door, more and more doors. And eventually, I'm actually invited. Hey, you're from the East Coast. I, Dr. Fred Hatfield, train at Gym X, Y, or Z near Baltimore. Why don't you come by? And it creates that sort of, and then it just so happens Captain Kirk Karwoski's there. And then that's a new conversation. And then that then is like, oh, well, I know Tom Platz. And then that's a new conversation. But you really did have to kind of go to the information. It wasn't just kind of beamed into your head like it is today.
Well, I think starting that way and instilling that work ethic in yourself is one of the most important things because, like you said, it's a snowball effect, and then you just build off it and build off it and build off it until eventually you do immerse this gigantic community, and we do have the ability now just to log on online and then converse with that community and run ideas off of people or see what's going on and whatnot. So maybe the perfect way to go about it, if there was one, if it could be recreated, is to be able to walk both walks and accumulate your knowledge to this certain point. And that brings me to, how do we utilize all the information out there? How do we begin to decipher putting together how we want to go about things? And let's narrow the lens a little bit, because we know people are watching this podcast because they want to learn more about PEDs. And going back to our conversation about the whys, we have a entire fitness industry of people that want to do what somebody says to do because it's good and it works and it's what everybody else does. So with your knowledge starting from the ground up and everything that you've learned to do over the years, everything that you've read about, everything you understand from your background in biology to practical application to using it with yourself and with athletes and everything like that, you've developed a very, very extensive, probably more extensive than you really give it credit for because you've been doing it for so long, method of building a course, and doing so for the particular person based on that person, what they've done before, what they haven't done before, what they need to do, what they need to accomplish. So let's go over how to build a course for perhaps the intermediate athlete, has some knowledge, maybe did a couple of the drives and the flights and established a presence in the communities online. They may have an idea about how to go about things, but let's take that person that might be somewhat advanced, but not quite with a full understanding, and let's look at it through the lens of physique enhancement, because that tends to be the vocal minority on Instagram, at least, and on YouTube. And
what goes into building a course for you? I know there's different columns of drugs, but then outside of anabolics, we have to look at training, we have to look at nutrition. Somebody comes to you, Broderick, and they say, I want to be chemically enhanced and I want to win a bodybuilding show. What are you looking at first? Like, what's the first thing that you start to assess?
Sure, and I can do that I think very succinctly because I do that in seminars regularly, sort of like a case study type scenario. But something you said really struck me as well. You've you've obviously consumed some of my content, and I think again, you don't give yourself enough credit in that you've absorbed that to the point where it's first nature, where it isn't to most people, and that is you use the word course. And I don't think like that one thing is like the pivot of the universe. What I do think is the pivot of the universe is developing and committing to a consistent language. When you have a consistent language, when a physicist in Norway talks about force, they're measuring it in newtons because that's the unit that you do that. So when they say force, everybody around the world knows precisely what they're talking about. When they say mass, there's an exact physics definition, and everybody knows what they mean by that. One of the, if not the biggest problem in our space is there's not a very well thought out, unified language. So when one person says mass, they think lead muscle. When I hear mass, I think attraction to the earth via gravity, which are not the same thing at fucking all. So developing and committing to and holding people to a standard of language so that when there is words spoken, the sender and the receiver are part of the same conversation. I think that is probably the biggest thing one can do for themselves, even before they even talk about drugs, is just have a language that is consistent. For instance, you use the language PEDs, which again, excellent, because performance enhancing drugs, there are loads of athletes that need no steroids, but they do need drugs to accomplish whatever thing they're doing. So that language really improves the thought process. I don't typically listen to podcasts, but somebody every once in a while will forward me an expert that I appreciate on a podcast because I don't scour the internet, so I never know who's doing what. But it just so happens somebody that I do very much appreciate, and I'll get back to the point in a minute, I promise. Somebody, Pavel Satsulin. He's a Eastern European coach, mostly strength and martial arts, actually. But he was talking about something, and Huberman actually interrupted him and said, You're describing a thing that actually exists. And Pavel paused and said, Well, please do explain. And Huberman says, You are creating a neuro linguistic framework. You are creating the words represent properly the thoughts, therefore, the actions, therefore, the word, the thought, and the action are all contiguous. Once you can get to that point, not only are the two people having the same conversation and sending and receiving the same words, but they also then start to take on different meanings and actions. And I use that in the example of a course. People will say, "Oh, help me design my first cycle," and I'm like, "That's asinine. A cycle is round. A cycle is a circle. A bicycle, unicycle, the cycles of the seasons, the menstrual cycle, they'll go back to the beginning. Who the fuck wants to risk their life, risk their freedom, spend a bunch of money to go back to where they started? That's not a thing you would do. So we need a better word. So I chose the word course. And that then gives you this neuro linguistic framework of I am somewhere and I want to be somewhere else. So I shall plot a course. And with plotting a course, then it gives the concept of a map, obstacles that you might need to navigate around, alternate routes if one runs into problems. It suddenly changes the very nature of your thought process. Other than, I want to take a bunch of drugs, gain 20 pounds, and then lose 20 pounds. That's a cycle. I don't want that. And I don't want that for my clients. So again, I wrote a wild tangent to get to the setup of that's the first part of creating this thing, is defining what this thing is.
I honestly, I love it, every second of it, because I couldn't agree more, because we need to really unify a lot of this information so we're speaking the same language, quite literally.
Okay. So now from there, you have an aspiring physique athlete. I'm going to use a male as an example because it's simply easier, but most of the same principles apply. Just gets considerably more delicate.
Mhm.
Women are hypersensitive, and there's a lot of going ons there, but the general thought process is the same. Usually what changes is the time frames, but nonetheless. So you have this aspiring physique athlete. The very first things I would do is that I am somewhere, I want to be somewhere else. Okay, where are you? I would do a relatively detailed analysis of how muscular are you above baseline? You started lifting weights at what? You lifted weights until you weighed what? You took drugs for the first time and then weighed what? And at what body composition? And what limb circumferences? What grew fastest? What didn't? That sort of thing. I would get as detailed an arc of how this creature, again, I'm a biologist by trade, how did this creature develop? Under what stimuli? Just being born did this, lifting weights did that, drugs did this other thing. Now we know where you actually are. Now where do you want to be?
What have you done to bring you to where you're at?
Right. Then we look at where you want to be. Now we have a sense of what is missing. By defining what is missing, we can then look at the palette of tools. What does that? Everybody knows, like, steroids work. Well, yeah, and you could just swallow any steroid off the shelf. Just start swallowing it, and it will, quote, work. But just like antibiotics, they work. Every antibiotic works. But it turns out some of them work better on urinary tract infections. Some of them work better on respiratory infections. Some of them work better on, and name your thing, but they all do the same thing. They all bind to a receptor, prevent bacterial reproduction. So weirdly, they all do the same thing, but yet not. We have exactly the same behavior in steroids. They all bind to the same receptor, do some sort of communication, and grow stuff. It's that fine bit of stuff that matters. By then interviewing, okay, what drugs have you used, in what combinations, at what dosages? And to me, one of the bigger factors is not just the dosage or the drug, but the dosage in relation to the body weight. To sort of create a dose to body weight, milligram to kilogram curve. Your first course, you weighed 80 kilos and took X amount of drugs, and you went to 85 or 90 kilos. That's going to give us a sense of dose response curve. So then we know, we can then kind of figure out in a vague sense, if this much did that much and we have that far to go. You just kind of like the old days of watching the sailing captains with the protractor. You could just start doing the little measurement. You're like, oh, we have 5 times that distance to go. We can kind of calculate how many milligrams per kilogram is going to take to get there.
Now, how do you factor that into titrating the compounds upward? Are you moving those as the body weight moves, or?
A perfect question that ultimately would be answered 2 ways. One, we're going to go to Instagram, look at all our shit. You'll see I periodically repost a little graphic. It's just obviously a square, and there's a line that goes roughly, I don't know if it's 45 degree angle. Let's call it a 1/3 of the line is escalation, and then 2/3 is plateau. That poor description. Geometry is not my strongest suit. I apologize. But what that's representing is milligrams escalate at about that angle on average for a physique to a plateau, then flatten out. The exact rate of escalation and rate of plateau is determined by a couple of things. One, the total length of the course, and two, the compounds in play, because some drugs are faster or slower acting than others that would impact that. If you're going to do a relatively short course, you're going to need relatively fast acting compounds. If you do an 8-week course and the drugs usually take 4 weeks to get there to peak plasma concentrations, you actually only did a 4-week course. That might be inadequate. So matching, again, right tool for the right job, determining all of these things. So again, it's that where am I versus where I want to go. One of the factors is how far away is that? Is it this phantom, I want to compete in the Olympia one day? Or is it, I need to be stage ready in 20 weeks? Those are two very different destinations with two very different planning strategies to get to them.
Now, in planning something that might be 20 weeks, I'm assuming you're not mapping out all 20 weeks because we got to see what happens. So what do you leave up to calling it on the fly versus mapping out in advance?
Well, it's funny you say that because I hear that all the time. People will make these assumptions that, oh, well, you obviously do this or you obviously do that. And most of the time, and this time included, unfortunately, you're wrong. And I don't mean to be an ass, but first of all, anabolic steroids particularly are very likely the safest drugs in the pantheon of drugs. Literally, just pause there and let's have that little quick conversation. Right now, whoever's listening, if you just go to your bathroom and open a medicine cabinet, there's probably 10 things in there that can fucking kill you. Swallow an entire bottle of aspirin, you're in real trouble. Swallow an entire bottle of Tylenol, probably dead. Swallow an entire bottle of ibuprofen, real trouble. Swallow a diarrhea medicine has killed more people than probably anabolic steroids. Like there are dangerous things in your house. There's something called the D50 rating. We don't need to go into it, but loads and loads. You have a bottle of Dianabol for some reason in your medicine cabinet. You swallow the whole thing. The worst outcome is you might shit funny for a day. That's it. So right out of the gate, we're talking now. Don't misconstrue that. I do not mean to say that steroids are safe. I've said repeatedly, there's no such thing as safe drugs. Drugs are drugs. Drugs are dangerous. Drugs are bad.
So everybody put down the whole bottle of Dianabol. Everybody holding a whole bottle of Dianabol right now, put it down.
Okay, but there's time course to consider, and the dangers of anabolic steroids are really time course related. I personally have been using anabolic steroids since I'm 16 years old. I'm coming up on 54. That's the danger, is 4 decades of exposure, not any one dose along the way. It's 40 years of skewed lipid profile. It's 40 years of exaggerated body weight. It's 40 years of beating the shit out of my orthopedic system, etc. We don't need to talk about me, but that's the risk. So first of all, for 20 weeks, there's very little that can acutely go wrong. Secondly, and again, here's a little bit of hubris perhaps, but I've been doing this a really long time. So if I do a sufficiently thorough interrogation of said client, we're only going to be wrong by a narrow margin. It's not going to go wildly wrong.
So you think a lot of these game day decisions aren't necessary, but it might just be minor tweaks and turns.
Game day is a different animal, but the general concept of what drugs, in what escalation, in what order, that's really pretty easy to get right. Even for someone wildly less practiced than me. That's really not that hard. These drugs are pretty predictable. And the handful that are not, most people have an experience and they know pretty quickly. I'll give you an example. Nandrolone. Nandrolone's it's almost 100 years old at this point. There is an opportunity for some depression and or erectile dysfunction. Good news, bad news. Good news, you'll know real fucking quick. Like the second week. Bad news, you just can't use that anymore. So most people kind of have that in this context, they're pretty much over that. They know, like, yeah, Nandrolone, yeah, floppy dick, don't care for it, rather not use it. Trenbolone makes me wildly aggressive. Probably don't want to use that unless we must. And then they rattle off the things they have used successfully. That
Mhm.
my work's half done. Now it's just a matter of what do they need, what tools remain, getting the proper tool in the proper place.
When we're
Now, in that
selecting these tools,
final window of where the art of what exactly do you want this physique to look like on stage,
mhm,
that is a different thing, and that is quite literally where I think bodybuilding bleeds from a hard science into almost an art, because there is an awful lot of opinion. There's a lot of other things, but the just generally steroids build muscle, dieting and cardio burn fat, do that. Like, that's pretty linear bridge building bullshit, really. I don't want to diminish my job, but honestly, it's kind of waterhead shit. It's not that hard.
understanding that it is a straightforward process that's wildly predictable, you do have some different columns to choose from. And I believe you're the first one that put them out there like that. So we obviously have, without overcomplicating it, we have DHTs, we have 19 NORs, and then we have your testosterone base, which we can talk about a little bit. Equipoise kind of falls in there as well, which most people don't know. But why would people select different columns outside of the simple, I've taken this and this has worked well, or I've taken this and I don't like this? What are some general guidelines for these columns?
And I'll give you. It's funny. I'm actually in the process of writing a book on that the family tree topic, and I do believe I am the first person to speak the language of family tree. But I
Mm-hmm.
can also say with all sincerity, it was not exactly my idea. It existed in the ether, just with very poor language and very bad referencing. It was already out there, and I just refined the coherence. So I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to take credit of like I sat down at a drafting board and did this thing. No, I just happened to be particularly good at internalizing and then vocalizing what I heard.
Mm-hmm.
So I do want people to understand that. Um, and the story of how I came to that is a little entertaining, and I will put it in the book, but nonetheless. So think of testosterone. First of all, this concept of family tree, it really is exactly that. It is a family tree. We're going to begin at the heading of testosterone as the patriarch. But the reality is that tree goes way, way up, all the way up to cholesterol. Cholesterol is sort of the ultimate parent, sort of the proto hormone. And then almost every one of these sex hormones is a derivative off of that family tree. Progesterone goes off this way, and prolactin goes that way from cholesterol. And we ultimately get to something called pregnenolone, which is sort of the immediate parent, and then testosterone. From testosterone, your liver manufactures an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase. Now, this is all within your body. All this stuff can then be done separately and much more easily in a laboratory. But there is testosterone now manufactured by the testes, or in a female, the ovaries, and interestingly, the adrenal gland. But nonetheless, testosterone is now here. The first thing is, let's talk about it as the parent, as the patriarch. It sort of has the master template. It is a very broad spectrum thing. Think about what testosterone does in nature. You take a 10-year-old girl and 10-year-old boy, especially, for instance, fraternal twins. They're very hard to tell apart. They have the same features in almost every way. If you see them clothed, they're very similar structure, very similar muscle mass, very similar behaviors, even. The
Mm-hmm.
purpose of testosterone is to create that hard fork in the road and masculinize the male version. And that masculinization definitely involves muscle mass, no doubt, but also bone growth, hair growth, behavior, deepening of the voice, thickening of the skin, an elevation in the recovery abilities, because that male is more likely to be more active. So it does all of these broad spectrum things. And once you're an adult and fully formed, and you don't need more hair or more thicker skin or some of these sort of developmental, almost metamorphic changes, an awful lot of testosterone's potential could be, I don't want to say wasted, but misguided, misplaced, and in many cases unnecessary. The liver can produce an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase, which does a clever chemistry thing called 5-alpha reduce. Um, when the book comes out, buy it. I'll explain in detail what the fuck that means. But in short, it makes this other hormone a derivative of testosterone in the body called dihydrotestosterone. By reducing it, it creates a condition where it attracts an extra hydrogen. So now you have testosterone with 2 hydrogens rather than 1, a broken bond at the 5 position. DHT on its own, it's actually a pretty negative thing. It's pretty aggressive, responsible for some hair loss potentials, possibly prostate growth, but it's also hyper anabolic. It's actually wildly more anabolic too. And again, got to be careful with the language. Anabolic is just a generic word that means make bigger. We could be talking about your fucking feet or your whatever. In this case, we're talking about muscle mass. It's actually hyper anabolic to muscle mass. The biological theory as to why that is that as you age, your testosterone values naturally decline. And your body has this mechanism of converting ever more of that limited resource into a more potent outcome. Now, yes, DHT is not good for your health, but weirdly, nature knows that the older you are, the less health you fucking have anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a way to add function rather than duration. Kind of throws a curveball at the whole longevity crowd, but I won't go wildly out of my way to piss on them because they're just kind of constantly in the drizzle anyway. So you got this new hormone called DHT. Then clever lab rats could then take DHT and modify it into considerably safer, but yet maintain some of that extra anabolic capacity. So you get drugs like Anabar, Winstrol, Primabol, Masteron. There's a slew of others, but those are the kind of the family-friendly ones everybody knows about.
Mm-hmm.
And because they're starting their kind of life as DHT, they are no longer additionally reducible by the liver. So, at least in theory, their impact on some of those negative things, hair, prostate, etc., is lesser. It's not a perfect world. It doesn't work exactly, but in a general sense. Plus, as this sort of family tree is taking shape, much like the periodic table of elements, if people know, that wasn't a thing that was just drawn one day. It just sort of emerged, and people started to realize that some of these columns have common factors. There's a column called the noble gases, and they all are non-reactive. Helium, hydrogen, helium, argon, krypton, radon, xenon. They're non-corrosive. So it was interesting. So that column-y, these are related somehow, and they have some similar characteristics. That emerged. One of the things that emerges with the DHT family is relatively speaking, you get less water retention, both internally and externally of the muscle cell. You tend to get more contractile force per unit milligram than the others. There are some other subtle details, but in general, just think lower water retention, usually considerably lower estrogen production, sometimes none, sometimes negative, and a training component that tends to lead towards strength.
Mm-hmm. So potentially better for performance.
Correct. Which can also be a feature of, right away, don't forget, that can be a feature of bodybuilding. Training needs to be supported. So it's not as if, oh, well, that's clearly where, weightlifters and shot putters would live. Well, yeah, that's a little bit true, but bodybuilders still do need to lift weights to initiate all the things that happen. It is conceivable that some of that component could come there. plus that whole no estrogen, low estrogen, potential estrogen suppression comes back into the conversation when you actually design this course. Moving to the middle column, you have obviously testosterone dead at the top. Clever laboratory people took testosterone. The first thing they did is say, well, can we make this oral? Can we make this orally viable? So they created methyl testosterone. It's literally just testosterone, a big ugly methyl group stuck to it, but it's enough to get it through your digestive tract and work. That was the first one. Then, considerably more clever, probably the same people, but more clever thinking, they tweaked it a bit to diethyl methylene. Then from there, they went, well, now we have this really awesome and pretty effective, pretty popular oral drug. Can we make that injectable? Then that led them to Boldenone.
Mm-hmm.
Now, interestingly, each one of those, even though they're very, very closely related, actually do have relatively different characteristics. But they all have a general characteristic of they're directly patterned off testosterone. They at least possess the potential to convert to estrogen, save one weird one, which is Titrating, OT, oral Titrating. Oral Titrating has a very unique alteration to make it orally viable that does not to 0, but goddamn near zero potential to convert to estrogen. But it's really well and truly an outlier. It's a weird one. But you'll just kind of get a sense of that kind of broad spectrumness. You get muscle growth, but you get some water retention, you get some fullness, you get some roundedness, you get some aggression, you get lots of red blood cell production, which could be very, very useful or potentially very, very fatal, depending on what sport you're doing. Jacking RBCs up to the moon and riding a bike up a mountain, amazing. Jacking RBCs up to the moon and then swallowing a diuretic can quickly lead you to blood clots, deep vein thrombosis, and death. So knowing what these drugs, what the potential outcomes of these columns of drugs is going to do, super useful.
Mm-hmm.
Moving over one more column, we have something called 19-nor testosterone. And if anybody in the room has had a science class, they've been exposed to Latin. If you've been exposed to Latin, you would know nor is literally no or without. So you literally now have testosterone minus the 19 position. Complicated chemistry, see a chart with all the carbon junctions numbered, but there is one number 19, and if you remove it, you get this new compound. It is considerably less masculinizing. Very good for women, potentially useful for men. It also comes with sort of the antagonist of the DHT column, which is you get more volume and water retention per unit milligram. So equal doses, for instance, of, say, primobolan and nandrolone, not necessarily muscle, but body weight would almost universally be higher with that 19-nor side because you're going to get more fullness, retention of water within the cell and outside the cell, possibly also additional retentions. Creatine synthase, glycogen synthase would create an environment where potentially more ions and carbohydrates would be within the cell, hence plumping it up for a very lowbrow language, but nonetheless. So now you start to create this idea of high strength, low body weight over here, high body weight, not that impactful on strength over here. You could start to see a framework developing. So then when you look at an athlete and you say, wow, you're strong as fuck, but a little undersized, DHCs are probably not going to be the answer to that person. Whereas on the other side, you have somebody that's just kind of lanky and lacks fullness and roundness and would look like a basketball player without the drugs. That's where the 19-nors come in to fill that area up.
So I'm very glad that you brought that up too, because I think a lot of people will hear something like water retention, then automatically just go, nope, this is bad. But like we were talking about originally, it's very user dependent because some people might need that, especially that intramuscular retention. Now,
it's funny. It's a joke around my office is a bad word because we all work virtually, but I have a team, and the team EvilGSP is not a joke. There genuinely is a team behind me, and we actually joke that people are constantly selling protein powder, muscles protein, protein synthesis, muscle protein. Well, muscle's 72% water. we've been desperately racking our brains to figure out a way to sell people water because it's the major component of muscle. There's got to be a way to commercially convince people that water is anabolic, and if they could just drink more of my water, they would be way bigger. Because mathematically, it's the largest component of muscle.
Somebody's going to listen to this and they're going to Liver King the shit out of this and make millions of dollars. And you know what? I'm all for it. So I support that 1,000%. I'll gladly interview that motherfucker, even if he's the dumbest person on earth, because that would be amazing.
Hopefully they send me a fucking t-shirt or something just for the residual, but nonetheless. So yes, water retention is not bad, especially if you have the knowledge and insight to put it where you want it and or gain control of it when you need it.
Exactly. Now, let's stay in this 19 NOR column and let's go a little bit deeper. And you probably know where I'm going with this because then we bring up Trenbolone, which is a 19 NOR by definition, but seemingly breaks all the rules.
I hear people say that, and I don't really buy that. I don't know that it does. I just think a lot of this stuff gets so folklorish that it becomes biblical, and I don't really know that God wrote that book. I think it's just the interpretation of man, and I think men suck at keeping records. Yes, Trenbolone is an outlier in some fashions, but not really. Let me step back. When you look at the characteristics of that family, one of the interesting things that doesn't get mentioned very often is testosterone is a weak progestin. Clever words, people might not know what that means, but every one of these sex hormones has a receptor, let's call it a socket, in which it clicks into to communicate its message. It just so happens that testosterone and progesterone are so similar in structure that testosterone can, in fact, interact with the progesterone receptor, something called agonize. It agonizes said receptor. The minor alteration that makes it DHT reduces that. DHT drugs are infinitely less likely to interact with the progesterone receptor. Move over to the 19 NOR column, that alteration increases the likelihood of interaction with the progesterone receptor. It is a less weak progesterone agonist. So as you then tweak Nandrolone into its many varieties, the major ones being Nandrolone itself, Trenbolone, and then even go as far as men, it just so happens that agonization of the progesterone and possibly other corticosteroid receptors goes up. So I don't really know that it's breaking any rules. It's just what you get in that column.
So it's almost just exacerbating the effects to a degree where we're seeing such a drastic difference.
Correct. And then also remember that the biggest thing we're exacerbating is fucking dosage. A normal human has 1,000 nanograms per deciliter of androgens. Normally, most people are taking that in testosterone alone. Then throw in the Trenbolone and the Primobolan and so you've got things dialed to 11. Plus, you've got a derivated, potentially hyperactive, hyperpotential drug. Yeah, you're going to get shit like this. Now, the one thing I would say kind of the two things I would say kind of universally carry through that 19 NOR family is, particularly as you get more and more derivated, you get more and more potential for emotional dysfunction. There does seem to be a tendency for that column to bring either the very, very good or the very, very bad emotional outcomes. And one must be aware of that.
Now, is that stimulating the amygdala, or is, without getting super into neuroscience, what's happening to cause that?
I am not a neuroscientist, so I don't really speak with strong authority other than it's been happening since the drug's been on the market, so we know it's a thing. I've heard a number of really interesting possibilities, ranging from actually crossing the blood-brain barrier at a higher affinity, at a higher percentage, and therefore having the opportunity to bind to receptors in the brain that other drugs may not. I've also, and this one I actually genuinely think is part of the equation. I'm also very confident that the 19-nor column at large, and Trenbolone in particular, seems to have stronger impact on the thyroid cascade from TSH all the way through to T3. And thyroid definitely then has an impact on emotional state.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a number of things at play, but I'm not prepared to put my finger and go, it's that. Because the minute you do that, you're universally wrong.
Right.
Biology's so complicated that this idea of it ever being one thing is just never right. So, again, weirdly, use Nandrolone as the example, but then we'll step back to Trenbolone. I don't know the exact number, but my many note keepings, and I keep so many fucking notebooks. My general statistical note keeping outcome is looks like about 2 out of 10 people get erectile dysfunction from Nandrolone.
Mm-hmm.
It's that low. Now, it's such a significant thing that it's really dramatized. Like, no one wants that. So if even one asshole gets it, it becomes quite the lore. Fair. But what doesn't make the news is about that same 2 out of 10 get hypersexual. You don't really hear about that because they're too busy fucking.
Right.
So we have a little bit of the same thing with Trenbolone. There's a smaller percentage of people that have these sort of amazing effects. But I actually, one of my lifelong training partners, I swear to you, his body interprets Trenbolone as vitamin C. The more he takes, the healthier he fucking is. The better his blood work, the happier he is, the better father he is, the better time he has at work. Like, it's the damnedest thing I've ever seen, but I'm watching it unfold for like 3 decades now. It's real.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that wild outlier, but just know they exist.
Yep, I can speak to that too. I know one of those, and every time we pull his blood work, I'm like, this is the time we're going to find out you're fucking dying. And every time he's healthier than me, and I'm kind of one of these longevity assholes now. So I don't know. It's all over the place. Let's keep going here a little bit without, we got to keep in mind that there's going to be like a whole facet of information that would be another 10 hours in and of itself. But once we've covered the traditional columns of anabolic steroids, how prevalent, or I guess you could say, how important or beneficial would it be to look into adding things like your growth hormone, your insulin? Is this something that you think everybody should be leveraging, or is it very case dependent and maybe less so than you would think?
Well, I mean, first of all, the word, again, going back to language, the answer is never everyone. That's never the answer.
Mm-hmm.
They're just full stop. Like, even this, the precious testosterone, like everybody thinks like testosterone is the cornerstone of the universe. Newsflash, some of the greatest golden era physiques that everybody loves to love and also pine for. Oh, I wish more people looked like, and then name. Not a fucking drop of testosterone in that picture they're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the answer is never everyone or no one. It's some zone in the middle. Now, those are definitely valuable tools. I tend to find by my mindset, they're implemented or deployed at kind of random and inappropriate times. Growth hormone, I think, is probably one of the most underutilized tools, even to the point where maybe people could begin a drug journey. Boy, I hate that word. It sounds very self-helpy, but in this case, it really probably is the right word. When you start thinking about course upon course upon course, it is a journey to somewhere. I think maybe people could even begin with growth hormone first, a la carte. If you look again at mechanistically, what does it do? One of the really valuable things that it does is develop infrastructure, both in children and then in adults. The actual framework that is and becomes your orthopedic system. So the sooner growth hormone becomes in play and at an effective condition, the earlier you are bulletproofing or strengthening the framework on which you're going to put on all this goddamn muscle and also all the weight that is required to build this muscle. So it's sort of using the vague analogy of it's potentially going to give you a more robust foundation which to put all this shit on.
Now, do you prefer to approach it as that foundational tool primarily, or are there cases where you would consider it more efficacious for fat burning than some of the traditional models for that, or maybe in higher doses for actual growth?
It definitely has value in both of those components. I think it's kind of day-to-day fat loss value is I don't want to say lesser than people think because it's not. It works, but I think it's sort of become somewhere between just standard practice and standard stupidity. The average bodybuilder is just not that fat.
Mhm.
Like that's kind of what makes them fucking bodybuilders. So just one less scoop of rice, numbnuts, and then save the growth hormone for bed to build infrastructure might be a superior outcome.
So when
preparing for the Olympia, where every single gram of body fat is a placing on stage, whole different conversation. But I think people tend to just don't look at the long picture. Right here is a great place to interject, and I don't want to run your podcast to the forever, but that concept of growth hormone being sort of foundational. Think about this. Momentarily leave bodybuilding and just think about sports and name your sport, whatever. I don't personally follow sports at all, literally at all, but soccer, baseball, American football, just tennis, name your sport. Go back to 1980. How many 40-year-old professionals can you name? It was a shockingly small number. And it was usually the random, like, wow, Jimmy Connors in tennis, like a random punter, a random fucking backup quarterback. Like there was a couple of people, Nolan Ryan in baseball. Like there was literally like 10 random outliers. Look at professional sports today. Every fucking name you can name, he's 40 years old. Do you really think their training's that much better? Their nutrition's that much better? Or do you think in the ensuing years, growth hormone hit the fucking market and these assholes just were financially capable and properly guided and just took it, and lo and behold, they last way longer?
Now, you've already answered the next question I was going to ask just in that, so that was awesome. So let's dive a little bit more into this concept of like foundational enhancement with that GH. So let's take an athlete in any facet, or maybe it's just, 35, 40-year-old guy that just wants to be jacked and look good and feel good, et cetera, et cetera. Just by adding, let's say, 2 to 4 units, and I know it's going to be different in every case, but adding a couple of units of GH before bed at night, what's that in general senses? What's that doing for that athlete?
Well, people usually want numbers. Like, how much stronger will I be, or leaner will I be, or longer will I live? And I have no official answers to any of that, and it's definitely not that last one. It's probably that last one's probably negative. Now, what they probably will be is considerably more functional. So I don't think it's a thing you can quantify, but we can mechanistically describe what that drug does. And mechanistically, what that drug does is gets basically just circulates through the bloodstream, causes the release of fat and carbohydrates, gets to the liver, and then is broken down into growth factors. All these precious fucking peptides that everybody's talking about, they're not being invented. They're being discovered. And they're being discovered because the nexus of growth hormone and the liver, that's where they're made. So all of these fucking peptides that everybody's pushing for every fucking thing in the world is literally happening at the intersection of sleep, liver, and growth hormone. So just let that play out. Just every night, you're going to fucking sleep. So you got that one covered, unless you're me. Take the fucking growth hormone and let it play out, and it'll do what it will do. I realize that's an almost embarrassingly lowbrow answer, but it's it's kind of like asking someone what dynamite does. It fucking blows up. We know that. Now, exactly where you wedge it, at what angle, and what can be the difference between blowing up the safe and blowing up the building. Like bank robbers have known that for fucking 100 years. But the dynamite, it does what dynamite does.
I couldn't agree with you more. And it's just one of those things that's so multifaceted and all encompassing. And again, that could be a whole other 10 podcasts in and of itself.
Yeah, and again, this kind of almost deference and laissez-faire attitude I have about it is actually not. It's only superficial, because it does what it does is the answer, but it does what it does predicated on the conditions that you have imposed. What life are you living? What level of weights are you lifting? What level of cardiovascular work are you doing? How fat or lean are you? How long or short do you sleep? And those are all structural things that are sort of innate to you. So the exact amount of IGF-1 or IGF-2 or fucking MT2 or all these things that can come from growth hormone is dependent more on who you are and what you're doing than anything else. Now, can you learn enough to start making strategic decisions to get different outcomes? Of course, if you're willing to spend a lifetime to track all of them down or pay someone who has done so. Yes. But the short answer is people have survived to where we are, to the level of technology and technocracy to have this shit, because our body adapts really well to our environment. That's kind of the big linchpin answer.
Mm-hmm.
So you have an environment, you take a drug, your body will do its best with it and give you the best outcome it thinks is right.
And I could not agree with that more. And again, it all comes down to some common themes that we have brought up several times now. And it's really, what are the settings that you're putting the drug into? What's the environment of the Petri dish? Who are you? What are you doing? What are your current surroundings? And that's overlooked so often.
If you could allow me one more little tirade before you probably shut us down at the hour.
Well, of course.
That segues exactly perfectly into that conversation of framework of language. You hear this even from doctors, which is terrible in my opinion. And by the way, I'm not one of these people that runs around bashing the medical community or big pharma. Not even a little bit. To be a doctor, even the worst doctor in the world, you have a pretty extensive fucking education.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not nothing. So I'm not bashing doctors, but they'll use this language of side effects. There really and truly is no such thing. There is just effects. There are in context desired effects and less desirable effects. But drugs do stuff. Some of the stuff you want, some of the stuff you don't. Selecting the correct drug, the correct dosage, and the correct timing can skew that a little bit. But at the end of the day, drugs do stuff. I will give you one real quick example that's germane to this conversation. Powerlifter or shot putter X, Y, or Z might take Masteron for the neurological impact and the muscle building. Okay. The side effect is the reduction of effective estrogen. Some unfortunate female might come down with estrogen dependent breast cancer and be prescribed Masteron for the estrogen modulating effects. The muscle mass, the mustache, the bad attitude are the side effects. So one person's effect is another person's side effect. Therefore, there really is no such thing. There's effects and what you want.
So basically, drugs do things, and we need to know what they do or what they have the ability to do and to apply them correctly.
100%.
Broderick, this has been absolutely amazing. It's so tempting for me to just want to keep deep diving into different segments of stuff because, I mean, honestly, it's been such a privilege to pick your brain here. And again, I have no reason to kiss your ass. You're already here. You've already done the podcast. So, dude, phenomenal. And I don't want to just gush about how great that was or what a great opportunity that was for everybody watching. For anybody that wants to deep dive more into your information, where do they find you? Where do they find more from Team Evil GSP?
Well, I'm glad you worded it that way because the where do they find me, the answer, and I know this is horrible to say in a public forum, but I hope they don't. I hope they don't find me. I really do want to almost be that super villain in a cave under a castle that nobody can find. However, all of my forward-facing content and persona, they can find in the Team Evil GSP member site, which is members.teamevilgsp.com. And by the way, all of our stuff, Instagram, Facebook, whatever we have is also at Team Evil GSP.
Amazing. And everybody, like I said in the beginning, I've been a member of the site for longer than I can remember, and it's worth every penny. And to be quite honest, it's not a whole lot of pennies. So definitely check that out. Sign up, dive into Broderick's social media, check out everything from his team. We would be honored to have you back in a future episode to maybe deep dive into another like sub niche category of some sort, or maybe we'll just talk coffee and ferrets. Who knows? But either way, it's been an honor to have you here today. Thank you so much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the DDT Method Podcast, and we'll see you next time.